Hello, my name is Father John Dyer. I'm 87 years old, and I've come here tonight to reminisce about my life and ministry in Colorado. Most of you know the part of my story in the early part. There are actually three different segments of my lifetime here in Colorado. I was age 49 by the time I got here. And from 1861, the year of my arrival, through 1874, I call those the pioneering years. Those were the years that I spent a great deal of time going around to the various mining camps in central Colorado, preaching the gospel. And I had many interesting experiences, and really few bad experiences in the mining camps of Colorado. I arrived in Buckskin Joe July 4th, 1861, and I really had only come out to Colorado to see the Pikes Peak region before returning back home to Minnesota and continuing my life as a preacher and a lead miner. But the week that I spent in Buckskin Joe convinced me that there was a great need for religion out here in Colorado Territory during the gold rush. And so the first Sunday I was in Buckskin Joe, I gathered together a crowd of people under a pine tree and preached the gospel. And their reception of the message encouraged me to think that perhaps God had sent me to Colorado for a larger reason than just my own curiosity. Long story short, as you folks are akin to say these days, I never returned to Lenore, Minnesota, my home there. I spent the rest of my life preaching and ministering here in Colorado, mostly along the Front Range and in the mountain camps of central Colorado, as I said. In 1862, that winter, because Methodist preachers made so little from preaching, I had to turn to other employment to get me through. And so someone who had been delivering the mail from Buckskin Joe, which is near Alma, over Mosquito Pass to Oro City or Leadville, decided he did not want to make that trip during the winter months. So he was looking for someone to take his contract. Well, it paid a pretty good stipend, and so I said, I'll take it. I must confess I wasn't sure what I was getting myself into, but crossing Mosquito Pass in the winter months turned to be a daunting challenge, and I made that trip at least twice a week. You probably know Mosquito Pass has a lot of snow in the wintertime, and it's the highest mountain pass, at least it was the highest mountain pass that I had encountered personally up to that time. So the only way to get across Mosquito Pass in the wintertime, you couldn't go by horse, the snow was too deep. You couldn't go by foot, you'd sink up to your eyebrows. So back then, if you needed to travel in the wintertime, you made a homemade pair of Norwegian snowshoes, we called them. They were 9 to 11 feet long, and you tied your boots to them with a leather strap, and that was all that kept you afloat on the snow going over the passes in the mountains during the wintertime. I lost the other skis of this pair somewhere up around San Elmo. So if you're around San Elmo and you find my ski, you call them skis, we call them snowshoes, please return it to me because this one's rather lonesome at this stage in its life. And you couldn't just start out any time of day to get over Mosquito Pass because during the day when the sun was shining, the snow softened up, and you're even on snowshoes, you would sink down into the snow, or the snow, being wet as it was, would collect on your skis, your snowshoes, and you'd have to take a couple of steps and then take your 9-foot pole, as long as the snowshoes were, and knock the snow off the snowshoe before you could continue on. It was a laborious and exhausting process. So I soon discovered that the best time to start out over Mosquito Pass was not during the daytime, but in fact at night. About 1 or 2 o'clock in the morning, the snow would have refrozen and a hard crust formed over the softer snow beneath, and then you could cross on snowshoes without undue danger to yourself. So that's when I made most of my crossings across Mosquito Pass. And that's also why it became known as the Snowshoe Itinerant. Now, how many of you might be Methodist or have some Methodist in your background here? Well, that's a pretty good representation, more so than many of the audiences that I've spoken to. But the rest of you may not know what the word itinerant means. And it means, in reference to preaching or preachers, a preacher who circulates around a circuit. He doesn't have a stationary appointment, one church where he lives in a parsonage for a period of time. The itinerant circuit riding preacher was always on the move. Now in the East, they mostly traveled by horse. In the West, some of them did, but I couldn't afford a horse. Ownership of a horse has a lot of expense and responsibility to it. And number one, I didn't make enough money to own a horse or keep it. And number two, there was nothing wrong with my feet. After all, I had walked over 800 miles from Lenore, Minnesota to arrive at Denver and then go on to Buckskin Joe. And in my early years, there was a Methodist annual conference held in Denver, and I could have taken the stagecoach from Buckskin Joe all the way into Denver for $10 one way, $20 round trip, but I didn't have $10, not even for one way. So I started 2 days early and I walked to Denver from Buckskin Joe. I received my appointment and I walked back to Buckskin Joe. And I walked to most of the places that I went in Colorado. The one exception was when I was appointed to start the Methodist work in New Mexico Territory. Now, I had had some brief encounters with New Mexico Territory, and I had written a letter to our bishop and said, there's great opportunity awaiting the Methodist Church in New Mexico. We should send somebody who understands the Spanish language to go down and begin the work. Well, the bishop kind of cooked on that for a year. And then at the following annual conference, he called on me and said, Brother Dyer, I know you don't know the language, but you know more about the territory than anybody else we have in Colorado. So he appointed me to go to New Mexico and begin the Methodist work there. That was the time I invested in a horse. And over the year that I was in New Mexico, I rode about 10,000 miles on horseback, visiting all the settlements that had been established at that time. And of course, the Roman Catholic religion was very prominent in the New Mexico Territory. They were there first, long before anybody else went there. And they had established missions and churches nearly everywhere where there was a population. And so the going was not altogether friendly for a non-Roman Catholic-oriented preacher to come in. In fact, the Roman Catholic Bishop of New Mexico had given instructions to his people that they were not to host me in their homes and they were not to allow me to hold preaching meetings in their homes. Well, some of them ignored that and did it anyway. And that year was a good year of ministry, establishing the Methodist work in that region of the New World. I also brought to New Mexico a man named John Harwood and his wife to help me in the ministry in New Mexico Territory. And as it turned out, they specialized in education. And so they started schools all across the territory and actually have been recognized as some of the pioneers of the education system in New Mexico. So both John and I were both surprised and saddened when we came back to Denver for the next annual conference, and the bishop up and away appointed me to a charge back here in Colorado, leaving John and his wife alone to do the Methodist work in New Mexico. You see, we had known each other in Minnesota, where we both answered the call to ministry and became ordained as Methodist preachers. And we've become even more fond of one another the time that we served together in New Mexico. So it was a sad and in some ways bitter parting when our paths went different directions. But that's another part of being a Methodist. We served where the bishop sent us. That was part of our commitment, part of our ordination vow, that we would go where we were sent. Generally, no questions asked. And we might complain, but it would do no good. And so we embraced even the hardest of appointments because we believed it was in service not only to the church, but more importantly, in service to the Lord. Over the time that I spent preaching in Colorado, it's just amazing how many places I went to. And one time I sat down and wrote out the list. And if you are interested in where I went, and you have a few minutes, do you have a few minutes? Are you interested in where I went? Well, here it's 2 pages. And I put them in alphabetical order, so it's easier for you to keep up with. I preached in Albuquerque, New Mexico, Alma, American Gulch, Bailey, Breckenridge, Browns Creek, Buckskin Job, Cache Creek. Do you know the first preaching in Cache Creek took place in a bar? About like that. Well, the bar wasn't that fancy. Most of the bars in the mining camps were just tents, if even that. Sometimes the bar owner would just bring in a long pine plank and put it on top of 2 barrels, and that was the bar. Nobody really cared too much about the environment in which they drank. They cared about the drinking. And that was one of the hard things about life in the mining camps, because it was very difficult work. I knew that personally as a lead miner. And I worked in some gold mines out here for other people to supplement my income as a Methodist preacher, which, as I've said, was not very much usually. So I had a heart for hard-working miners. And one of the things that made their lives more difficult was the limited choices they had in how to spend their downtime when they weren't in the mines, which was very little. But it seems that the only thing they wanted to do when they were dead tired and dead dirty like that was drink and dance with soiled doves, degraded women, I called them, and gamble. And so I preached against these things because, in my view, they were detrimental to the health and happiness of miners. Now, you have to understand that most miners came to Colorado after a tremendously wide-felt financial disaster just a few years before gold was discovered in Colorado. And because Colorado was a good deal closer to the east than California was, a whole new wave of people became interested in the Colorado gold rush. And many of them were coming with the hope that in a brief time they would be able to find a stake and mine it to their benefit and raise enough of a fortune to be able to go back and provide better for their families. But that also meant that most of the population in the mining camps were male. And the only females that came were, as I say, the degraded women, the soiled doves, the dance hall girls. And then the gamblers came along. That's where a lot of folks made their money. The gamblers and the merchants that were selling things the miners needed oftentimes made more money than the miners and the prospectors did. So I preached against the things that were detrimental to a miner's health and happiness. It was difficult because when they came west, they left home and family behind. They entered into an uncharted territory, both behaviorally and geographically. There was nothing to keep them bound to the way that they had grown up and the religion in which they'd been trained. And so they oftentimes lived a rather wild life. I kept trying to remind them that there was a better way to live. So I preached against these things that degraded their life. Well, in Cache Creek, as I say, the first preaching, and I was the first preacher in many of these places. But Cache Creek, just north of Buena Vista, I preached in this saloon, and about 100 people finally showed up for my preaching service. And that night, bottle and cards were replaced by hymn book and Bible, at least for a short time. And the owner of the saloon was quite accepting of my being there to preach. Well, that was a little side trip we took at Cache Creek, but I've also preached at California Gulch, Central City, Colorado City, which came to be known as Colorado Springs, Cripple Creek. My association with Cripple Creek is rather interesting. It came at the very end of my life. Cripple Creek is on the western side of Pikes Peak, as you may know, and all of the experts in mining and geology said there was no prospect of finding gold on that side of Pikes Peak. There were none of the signs that they looked for in terms of deciding where to prospect for gold. Well, there was one fellow whose name I have forgotten, but he was known in the area as being kind of loony because he kept insisting on prospecting on the western side of Pikes Peak, where anybody who knew anything about mining knew you'd never find anything, until he found what came to be the richest find of gold in Colorado. And overnight, Cripple Creek sprang up, as all the successful gold mining locations did. You know, some were here today and gone tomorrow, and some were here today and gone today. The finds were that scarce. They just petered out too quickly. But there were some places like Central City and certainly Cripple Creek and Victor and other places where the finds of gold were so enormous that millions and millions and millions of dollars were taken out of the earth, and Cripple Creek became the richest gold mining district in Colorado. Well, when it was first discovered, as I say, I was in my late 80s, but as a miner and as a preacher to the gold mining camps for all of my life in Colorado, there was something about the find in Cripple Creek that just pulled at me. I had spent that previous summer on the porch of my sister Elizabeth Intrican in Bailey when the news came about Cripple Creek, and I packed up and left for Cripple Creek almost immediately. I was the first preacher to preach at Cripple Creek. My son Samuel and I staked out claims on a couple of mining possibilities, neither of which really panned out. But Samuel ended up living in Cripple Creek, and he became the town clerk. And his son also continued to live in Cripple Creek, and between the two of them, they also ran a funeral home in Cripple Creek. So that was my last gold mining experience and my last gold mine camp experience before the end of my life. Anyway, I'm getting stuck on my list. Central City, Colorado City, Cripple Creek, Dayton above Twin Lakes. Well, I also preached in Delaware Flats, Denver, of course, Divide, El Paso, Elena Gulch, Fairplay, Fort Garland, Fort Lupton, Gold Run. Getting tired yet? Grant, Hamilton, Las Vegas, Leadville, Lincoln City, Manville, or Buena Vista as it came to be called. By the way, I founded the group of Methodists in Buena Vista that built the first church building in Buena Vista, the Methodist Church. It was followed shortly after that by the Roman Catholic Church and the Congregational Church. They were the first three church buildings in Buena Vista within about 3 years of one another. I preached in Mayo Gulch, Monument. May I tell you something about the parsonage and Monument? Now, we preachers didn't always have parsonages. Not all of the stationary charges, which was what Monument was when I went there, they didn't all have parsonages. Now, Monument did, but they didn't all have nice parsonages. And nice, by the standards of the 1880s, is quite different than the standards of your day. But the parsonage and Monument was in the back of a bowling alley. And it was a rather rickety building at that. And one night a terrific storm came through Monument, and it woke my wife Lucinda up, my third wife, whom I haven't told you much about yet, but I will. And she said, "John, it sounds like the house is going to be blown over. Go out and see what's going on." So I went out into the storm, and sure enough, our home was kind of leaning to one side. So I propped it up with some wood and went out to investigate the next morning, and sure enough, we couldn't live in the back of that bowling alley any longer. And so, not for the first time or the last time, out of my own pocket, I paid for the expenses to build a new parsonage, which of course I couldn't take with me when I left, and we were never any place for more than 2 or 3 years, but at least it left a better home for the next preacher to come and live in. Montezuma, Montgomery, Mosquito, Park City and Georgia Gulch, Pueblo, Salida, St. John, Santa Fe, Taos, Tarryall, and wherever people gathered to hear the Lord's word preached. It didn't really matter. I gathered folks together wherever I went, even in between charges or appointments between gold mining camps. And I found across the 40 years or so of my preaching ministry in Colorado that people generally were welcoming to hear the gospel preached.